You made reference to Argentina, which is a country that has sort of promised and promised. And I know we're not here to speak about individual countries, and certainly not South Africa. But I wonder if we were to take a step back, which is the country that's just quietly getting on with things? You spoke about reforms and second-order reforms. Who's just steadily getting on with the work that needs to be done?
Well, just a word on Argentina. I mean, they're at the very beginning of a very uncertain and very complicated process, and we certainly are there to try to provide as much help as we can to help them getting through this. But its implementation of the kind of reform that they need to implement is going to be quite complicated. So we'll see if they're, and we certainly hope that they're going to be successful. I think it's the answer is that it's been a steady process. I think a number of I discharged on the improvement in fiscal and monetary frameworks in emerging market economies. I don't think there's been necessarily a big jump. Again, I'm going to turn to Daniel and see whether we have any input on that. But I don't think there is anything that stands out as a major change in the institutional environment. But we have a continuum of reforms that are implementing. When we look at you look at countries like India, you look at countries in Latin America, you look at other countries in Asia, or in Africa. I think there are a number of countries that are doing the right thing. I mean, one example might be if I take the example of Ghana. So we're going sort of at the other extreme. Ghana is a country that had extreme difficulties to restructure its debt, is under an IMF program. But since 2022, it's made a tremendous progress in stabilizing its economy, trying to put its fiscal house in order, trying to implement a number of steps that would put them on the right path. And we saw, for instance, earlier this week, 2 days ago, Ghana announced that they were cutting their interest rates. The central bank of Ghana cut its interest rate in the context of inflation decreasing very rapidly in the economy. They were able to do that while maintaining a relatively tight monetary stance. So that's a sign of success. So I think there are a number of countries that we can look at that are making steps that are going in the right direction.
Last question from me, and then we'll come to the room. All the way back in 2009 or 2010, the late Queen Elizabeth met a group of economists and addressed them and said, "How come none of you saw this coming?" Reference to the global financial crisis. What is the greatest risk that you see to your forecasts?
Well, there are some, there are always dark corners. There are the things that we can see, and then, of course, we're worried the most about the things that we don't even know exist. I think back in 2008, there was much less of an appreciation in some of the research institutions that are looking at macroeconomic environment of the kind of deep interconnection between financial sector and the macroeconomy. Now, interestingly, this is not something, if you had spent some time at the IMF, or if you had spent some time working in developing and emerging market economies, you kind of knew that the connections between financial sector and the macroeconomy are deep and are very profound. But this was not viewed as something that was relevant for advanced economies. And so there was more of a sense that the financial sector needed to be regulated on its side, but it couldn't really, financial crisis on a big scale couldn't really happen there, etc. So that was kind of the blind spot then. Obviously, this is not the blind spot anymore. There's a lot of attention going on, and think about macroprudential policies. You think about all of the financial stability reforms that have been put in place. There is enormous attention that is paid to the financial sector, and by and large, the financial sector has become much more resilient, both in advanced economies and in emerging market economies. And a good example for this was the financial instability in March of last year with the regional banks in the US, SVBs, and a few others that all of a sudden went belly up, and Credit Suisse in Switzerland. And there were a lot of concerns about, could that morph into, again, a financial crisis on a broader scale? Could that escalate? And it hasn't happened. First, because regulators were on the ball. They were very responsive. The central banks reacted very, very quickly. And second, because the financial sector itself was much more resilient. It was much better capitalized. Obviously there were some lapses in terms of surveillance and monitoring of some of these regional banks, but by and large, large financial institutions were totally fine. And so that's the sense in which this has improved. So if I think about the kind of things that could really derail the continued recovery in the global economy, clearly one of the things I worry most about is some sort of escalation of geopolitical risk that would again lead to a surge in energy prices, maybe not on the scale of what we saw in 2022, but something of that nature would hit an economy that has not been completely healed yet, and so the effect could be stronger this time again. It's like being a second blow, if you want. So I'm not as concerned about the financial part. I am concerned that emerging market economies have come out and have been resilient, but as I've highlighted, they may also be vulnerable. And so tightening of financial conditions may not manifest itself in terms of banking crisis or financial crisis in advanced economies, but I think some emerging economies could find themselves facing some pressure. So these are two of the risks that I think are reasonable concerns to have.